The shout came during the quietest part of the song, right where the band dropped down to almost nothing, and Elvis's voice was carrying the melody alone, and it cut through 15,000 people like a rifle crack. "You don't know what it's like." The words hung in the air of the arena for a full second before anyone reacted, long enough that some people in the back rows weren't even sure what they'd heard or where it had come from. Elvis stopped singing mid-phrase. The band, trained by years of touring to follow him rather than the sheet music, faltered and dropped out entirely within 2 bars, leaving nothing but the low hum of amplifiers and 15,000 people suddenly straining to hear. It was March of 1972, at an arena in Ohio, midway through a tour that had up to that point gone about as smoothly as any tour Elvis had run in years. He was 40 pounds lighter than he'd been on the '68 comeback special, in good voice, working through a set that leaned heavily on the ballads that had become his signature in that period. Songs about longing and loneliness that audiences in 1972 heard very differently than audiences might have heard them a decade earlier. Because by 1972, a huge portion of any American arena crowd had a brother, a husband, a son, or a friend who had come back from Vietnam changed, or who hadn't come back at all. The man who'd shouted was named Walter Hutto, 31 years old, a former army corporal who'd done 2 tours near Chisan and come home in late 1970 to a country that mostly wanted to talk about anything else. He was sitting 12 rows back, on the aisle, and he'd come to the show that night because his sister had bought the tickets months in advance as a birthday gift, hoping, in the quiet way families sometimes hope for these things, that a night out might do him some good. It hadn't occurred to her, or to Walter himself, until he was sitting in that seat with the lights going down, that the particular song Elvis chose to perform that night, a slow ballad about a soldier writing home, would land on him the way it did. He hadn't planned to say anything. By his own account, given years later in a newspaper interview that surfaces occasionally in retrospectives of that tour, the words had simply come out of him, unbidden, the way certain things did in those years without much warning. One moment he was sitting in the dark listening to a song about a soldier's letter home, and the next he was on his feet, his voice cracking through the arena's stunned quiet, saying the thing that had been sitting in his chest for 2 years without an audience willing to hear it. "You don't know what it's like." Security personnel, stationed at intervals along the aisles the way they always were at arena shows, began moving before anyone had given them instructions to. It was reflexive. A disruption during a performance, especially one loud enough to stop the band, was the kind of thing security handled fast and quiet, usually before the crowd around the disruption even had time to register what was happening. 2 guards were already converging on Walter Hutto's row, hands reaching to guide him toward the aisle, when Elvis did something that stopped them as fast as it had stopped the band. He held up one hand, palm out, toward the guards, and with the other he pointed, calm and direct, toward the general area where the voice had come from. "Hold on," Elvis said into the microphone. "Hold on now, let him be." The guards paused, uncertain, looking toward the wings for a signal from someone with more authority than a hand gesture from the performer. But Elvis wasn't looking at them anymore. He'd walked forward to the very edge of the stage, guitar still hanging from its strap, and he was looking out into the crowd, trying to find the face that belonged to the voice. "Say that again for me," Elvis said. "I want to hear you. Go on." The arena was silent in the particular way that 15,000 people can be silent when every one of them understands, almost simultaneously, that whatever is about to happen matters more than the show they came to see. If a story like this is landing with you the way it's landing with us right now, that's exactly why we make these the parts of these legends' lives that never made the highlight reels, the small human moments that outlast the hits. If you want more of them, hitting subscribe genuinely helps keep this going. And if you're already glad you clicked on this one, the like button takes about a second, and it tells us we should keep digging up stories like this. All right, back to that arena in Ohio. Walter Hutto stood there in the aisle, flanked by 2 security guards who were now waiting on Elvis rather than acting on their own instincts. And for a long moment he said nothing at all, Later, he would describe that pause as the longest few seconds of his adult life, longer than anything he'd experienced overseas, because at least over there he'd known, roughly, what he was supposed to do. Here, in an arena full of strangers with a microphone pointed at him metaphorically, if not literally, he had no idea. "I said you don't know what it's like," Walter finally repeated, quieter this time. Though the arena was so silent, his voice still carried. "You're up there singing about a letter home like it's some kind of romance, like it's pretty. It's not pretty. None of it was pretty." A ripple went through the crowd, the sound of thousands of people shifting in their seats at once, some uncomfortable, some suddenly very still. A handful of people near Walter reaching out instinctively to put a hand on his shoulder or his arm, the way strangers sometimes do for each other in a moment that feels too large for any one person to hold alone. Elvis didn't flinch, and he didn't argue. He stood there at the edge of the stage with the microphone loose in his hand, and when he spoke again, his voice had none of the performance polish that had carried the last hour and a half of the show. It was quieter, rougher around the edges, a voice that sounded, several people in the front rows said afterward, more like a man talking to one other man than an entertainer addressing an arena. "You're right," Elvis said. "I don't know what it's like. I never went, I never had to. And I've sung that song maybe 200 times on this tour and never once stopped to think about what it might sound like to somebody who actually lived it. That's on me. I'm sorry." The apology, delivered flatly and without any attempt to soften it or turn it into a moment of performed humility, seemed to catch the crowd as much off guard as the interruption itself had. Elvis Presley did not, as a rule, apologize on stage. He joked, he charmed, he occasionally scolded a rowdy section good-naturedly, but a direct, unadorned apology to a heckling audience member was not part of any show anyone in that building had ever seen him give. "What's your name?" Elvis asked. "Walter," he said. "Walter Hutto." "Where'd you serve, Walter?" There was another pause, shorter this time, and then Walter said it. "Chisan. 2 tours. Got back in 70. Elvis nodded slowly, and for a moment he just stood there looking out at the man, guitar hanging forgotten at his side, the arena holding its breath around both of them. "I've got some fellas who work for me who went over there," he said. "Good men. I've watched what it did to a couple of them, even from a distance, even not really understanding it the way I should. I know it's not the same as living it, I know that. But I'm not going to stand up here tonight and pretend that song is some kind of pretty postcard. Not now that you've told me it isn't. You want to tell these folks what it was actually like. You don't have to. But if you want to, I'll listen. And I expect there's a whole lot of people in this building who lost somebody or sent somebody and would want to hear it too." The recontextualizing moment, the one that people who were in that arena still talk about when the story comes up, wasn't Elvis's apology itself. It was what happened in the several seconds after he made the offer, when the silence in that building shifted from the silence of shock into something else entirely. The silence of an audience realizing, almost all at once, how many of them were sitting there with someone in mind. A brother, a husband, a son, a friend from the neighborhood who'd gone over and come back different, or hadn't come back at all, and how rarely anyone in their daily lives ever gave them a genuine, unhurried opening to say so out loud. Walter Hutto stood in that aisle for a long moment, and then, in a voice that shook but held, he began to talk. He didn't tell war stories in the cinematic sense. He talked about the sound of the choppers at night, about how he still couldn't sleep with a window open because of it, about a friend named Danny who hadn't made it home and whose mother still set a plate for him at Thanksgiving out of habit nobody had the heart to correct. He talked, briefly and without elaboration, about coming home to an airport where nobody met his eyes, where a stranger had called him a name he wouldn't repeat, where he'd learned within his first week back that most people, faced with what he carried, simply preferred not to know. The arena listened, 15,000 people, many of whom had come that night for nothing more complicated than a good show and a few hours of Elvis Presley's voice, sat in near total silence and listened to a stranger's grief spill out into a building that had never been built to hold something like that, and somehow, for those few minutes, it held it anyway. When Walter finished, or trailed off rather, unsure himself of how to end what he'd started, Elvis let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again. "Walter," he said, "I want you to know something, and I want everybody in this building to hear it same as you. What you just did up there took more guts than anything I've ever done on any stage in my life. You came home to people who didn't want to hear it, and tonight you told 15,000 strangers anyway. That's not weakness. Whatever anybody's told you since you got back, that's not weakness. That's about the bravest thing I've seen in this arena tonight, and I've been on this stage for an hour and a half." He turned briefly toward the wings, where his band and crew stood watching, uncertain what came next, and gave a small nod that nobody in the audience fully understood the meaning of until a moment later, when the band began quietly to play the opening bars of a different song entirely, not the ballad they'd been performing when the interruption happened, but an older gospel number Elvis sometimes closed shows with, one built around themes of burden and rest that felt, in that moment, chosen with obvious deliberate care. "This one's for you, Walter," Elvis said, "and for anybody else in this building carrying something they haven't had a place to put down. You don't have to carry it alone tonight, not in here." What followed, according to multiple accounts collected over the years from people who were present, was unlike anything else in the show. Elvis sang the song not as a performance piece, but as something closer to a prayer. His eyes closed through most of it, his usual stagecraft entirely absent, replaced by something rawer and less polished, that nonetheless held the room more completely than any of the evening's bigger, flashier numbers had. Several people in the crowd that night, in later interviews, described crying without entirely understanding why, caught up in a wave of collective release that had built unexpectedly out of one man's interrupted grief. Security, for their part, quietly stood down. The two guards who had been sent to remove Walter Hutto from his seat instead found themselves standing at the end of his row for the rest of the song, and when it ended, one of them, by Walter's own account years later, reached out and shook his hand without a word, an unplanned gesture that Walter said meant more to him than almost anything anyone had said to him since coming home. Elvis didn't try to fully return the show to its previous rhythm right away. Instead, before starting the next song, he addressed the crowd once more, his tone lighter now, but still carrying the weight of what had just happened. "I want to say one more thing," he said. "There's a whole lot of young men out there tonight, and a whole lot of families sitting with them, who carried something home from over there that most of us are never going to fully understand. I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I know what to do about that, because I don't. But I know this. If any of you see one of these men struggling, don't look away, don't cross the street, sit down next to him, buy him a cup of coffee, let him say the true thing instead of the polite thing. That's not much, but it's not nothing either, and Lord knows it's more than most of us are doing." The show continued after that, though several people who were present said the atmosphere for the remainder of the night never quite returned to what it had been before the interruption, replaced instead by something quieter and more communal, an audience that had been, in the space of 10 unplanned minutes, drawn closer together than any planned segment of the show could have managed. News of the incident spread through word of mouth in the days that followed, though in an era before instant recording and viral clips, it never became the kind of story that made national headlines the way a similar moment might today. A single regional newspaper ran a brief item about an emotional moment at the Ohio show without naming Walter Hutto directly, out of respect for his privacy, a detail that later biographers and fans researching the tour have had to piece together slowly, through interviews given decades afterward by people who were there and never forgot it. Walter Hutto, for his part, gave only a handful of interviews about that night over the following 40 years, always reluctant, always careful with his words, a man who seemed to understand instinctively that the moment belonged as much to everyone else in that arena as it did to him. In one of the last interviews he gave, in his 60s by then, he described what happened next in his own life in the aftermath of that show, with a kind of plain honesty that avoided any temptation to overstate what one night could or couldn't fix. "It didn't cure anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I still had bad nights for years after. Some things you carry your whole life, and anybody who tells you one good moment fixes all that is selling you something. But that night gave me something I hadn't had since I got back, which was the simple experience of saying the true thing out loud in front of people and having them not look away. Having a man like that, famous as he was, tell me in front of 15,000 strangers that what I did took courage, instead of telling me to sit down and be quiet, that mattered more than I can put into words, even all these years later. He kept, for the rest of his life, a small newspaper clipping about the show folded into his wallet, the one brief regional item that had run without his name, and he would sometimes take it out to show people when the story came up, not out of pride exactly, but as a kind of anchor, proof to himself on hard days that the night had actually happened the way he remembered it. Elvis, for his part, rarely discussed the incident in interviews either. When a journalist asked him about it briefly the following year, during an unrelated interview about the tour, he gave a short answer that avoided any of the self-congratulation the moment might easily have invited. "There was a fella at one of the shows who'd been through something I hadn't," he said. "Seemed to me the least I could do was stop the music and listen. Don't know why that's remarkable. Seems like it ought to be the normal thing to do." But those who were in that arena in Ohio in March of 1972 understood it as something more than normal, precisely because it was so rare. They had watched a performer at the height of his fame stop an entire show, silence his own band, and turn an arena of 15,000 strangers into something closer to a congregation, all because one grieving man had shouted something true into a silence that nobody else had been willing to fill. They had watched security guards stand down without being told to, watched a room full of strangers hold their breath together, watched a wound that an entire culture had been quietly encouraged to look away from get spoken out loud in public, briefly and imperfectly, and get met for once with something other than silence or dismissal. Danny's mother, the mother of the friend Walter had mentioned that night, the one who still set a plate at Thanksgiving, heard about the incident second-hand from a neighbor who'd been at the show, and by Walter's account, she wrote him a short letter afterward, the only time she ever mentioned the concert to him directly. The letter said simply that she was glad somebody, somewhere, had let her son's memory be spoken about as something more than a name on a list, even for just a few minutes, in front of strangers who would carry the memory of that night forward, whether they'd known Danny or not. Walter Hutto passed away in 2019, in his late 70s, and among the small collection of personal items his family later found while going through his belongings was that same folded newspaper clipping, worn soft at the creases from decades of being taken out and put away again, along with, tucked just behind it, a ticket stub from a March night in 1972 that had cost him nothing more than the price of admission and had given him back, if only for 10 unplanned minutes, the simple and rare experience of being heard. Dramatization note, inspired by real themes. Specific dialogue and details are fictionalized for storytelling purposes.